Hey everyone, I'm here with Kelley Halpin from Mesa. Kelley, thanks for taking the time. Tell me a little bit about Mesa and what you all do.
Yeah, no, appreciate you having me on. Really excited to chat and tell you more about what we're doing. So, Mesa, we are trying to solve the home cost crisis because homeownership has never been more unaffordable in the US. It's a third of people's incomes on average. As a nation, we spend $6 trillion, which is more than healthcare, Social Security, and national defense combined. And so, what we do is we put more value back in homeowners' pockets by rewarding every dollar they spend on their home, by building the first homeowner membership platform. And the way we do that is by bringing credit card style benefits and rewards to every financial product for your home, from credit cards to mortgages to eventually warranty, HELOC, and more. All of that makes homeownership more affordable and rewarding.
So tell me a little bit, give me some details here. I'm trying to visualize what that looks like.
Sure. Yeah, so it really starts with our card. So the Mesa Homeowners Card is the first credit card, premium credit card built for homeowners. So meeting the homeowner where she is today and rewarding her for all of that spend. So your base spend, obviously, your everyday spend of gas and groceries, as well as home-related spend. So think HOAs, utilities, goods, home improvement, etc., as well as her mortgage payment. So just a ton of really differentiated value to her, as including a bunch of really kick-ass benefits. So things like big box membership or statement credits to Thumbtack for home services, a bunch of other really exciting brands we'll be able to announce in the next few weeks, but loading about $800 worth of value into a $0 annual membership fee card. So just, again, all of it in the spirit of like, if you spend $1 on your home, we want to give you value back for that. We do the same thing when it comes to our mortgage marketplace product, where we're going to give you 1 point per dollar of the loan. So if you get $1 million mortgage, you just got 1 million points, which is about $10,000 worth of value versus zero elsewhere. So again, just trying to bring that credit card style benefit and rewards experience to all these financial products that have never had it before.
Very cool. So what's the founding story? What was the aha moment that got you started?
Yeah, man. So I've kind of always been in the startup world. So was at Uber back in the day when that was kind of a black car company folks didn't know about. And that kind of taught me how to be an entrepreneur. It's allowed me to start 3 companies since. And most recently was working with my co-founder in consumer finance. So credit cards, rewards, life supplemental health insurance, that type of stuff. And in that world, as you know, like you're always looking at budgets and spend and trying to capture wallet share and things like that. And you realize just how much money people spend on their homes. And everything in rewards particularly has been travel and dining, travel and dining. And that was kind of the aha moment for us. It's like, well, actually this homeowner is an even better customer. She's high spend, high income, high FICO, but has never really had anything built for her and where she actually spends her money. Like everything's been built around this business traveler, which is great, but it's just kind of one narrow subset. So that was kind of the aha for us, and obviously a very timely mission, right? Like home ownership in the US is the bedrock of the American dream, and it's getting out of reach for most Americans. And so this is how we think we not only make a big impact in a positive way in the world, but build a generational business from an outcome perspective.
Makes sense. So as you mentioned, you've started a few companies, you've worked at kind of generational companies like Uber. What have you learned from those experiences that you're bringing to Mesa?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, like great people build great companies, hard stop. And so I think from the very beginning, before we even had a name, Peyton and I wrote down like cultural values, and particularly like people first is number one for us. And so like we knew if we got the right, it's a cliche, right? Like right people on the bus, whatever you want to say, it's true though. And so if we got the right people in the company, 2 really smart people can figure anything out. The best idea in the world with mediocre people is just not going to work. And so that's why we've really focused on hiring and talent. I've probably spent a quarter of my time since we started the company a little over a year ago hiring. And so it's really paid off in terms of the quality of talent we have. And we've got Nadia, our CFO, was the first finance hire at Robinhood. Tina on our team was the 5th employee at Built. Like we've gotten some really heavy hitters, and just because we've really focused on that, like more than anything, like talent is the most important thing. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time. We throw a lot of our energy. And I think that's Uber hired really, really well. And I've just seen that time and time again, like great people build great companies.
How do you think about that, especially when you're smaller? What was your secret to bring some of these really talented people on that had great experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple of things. I could talk for hours on hiring. I think, one, come up with a compelling mission that people believe in, right? Like people are, smart, talented people need to feel like they are working on a mission that matters, right? that can not only make the world better, but also deliver a really big company and outcome. And I think we have that. I think too, it's brute force, man. It is an exercise in just persistence. And that if I have a superpower, that's what it is great people are not actively looking. And so almost everybody in our company has come from like direct outreach or referral. Like, you'd be very specific on who you want to reach and what companies, what background, and then you go get them. And then, make sure you got the right process to make sure they're the right fit and all those things. But there's no real secret to hiring. I found it's just like brute force.
Is there a story that you have where you convinced someone to join?
Yeah, for sure. So Nadia, who I mentioned, Nadia is amazing. I mean, she's a killer. She's the person that joined and said, if you sell this company for $1 billion, I'm going to be really disappointed. And so like that's like on my level, which I love. And so for her, I probably asked 10 of our mutual connections to get us an intro. I sent her a bunch of emails. Finally, she took the meeting and I had to really sell her, obviously, like she could be doing anything in the world. And so I think it's just one example. I think like being able to recruit is probably the most important skill a founder has. Now it's sales like everything else, but I think that's the hardest sale you're ever going to make, man. You got to convince somebody to come give their time, right? An investor can give you money and walk away, but somebody giving you their time and their future, like that's a really, really significant thing. And so it's a very hard sell to close.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, time is one of those things you can't get back. Either you have it and you use it, and that's it. So it's way more scarce, I think, than money in a lot of cases. So
100%.
Why did you want to get in touch with Nadia in particular? Like, why get the 10 intros to her? What set her apart when you saw her profile?
Yeah, I think with every role, we try to be very specific of like, what's our strategy, right? Like not just the JD, which I think are kind of more externally facing. It's like, what are we trying to achieve with this role? What are the key outcomes this person would drive? What's the type of person that has that background and what companies? And so you get to a pretty narrow specific list. And then, okay, here's somebody that was early at Square, who was the first finance hire at probably the most successful fintech in the last 30 years. And we need a kick-ass CFO. And so that to me was like, this is our person, hell or high water. I'm going to go get my person.
Talk to me a little bit about the pitch to people. Like, what do you go to them? Why is Mesa a great place to work?
Yeah, I mean, I think why is this a great place to work? I think one, we've got an amazing mission that people, believe in. They know is going to make the world a better place. Two, it's going to deliver a huge generational business. Like you can't have one without the other. Like if this is anything less than $100 billion business, we've probably wasted our time. And three, I think you get to do it with amazing people in a culture that's going to bring out the best in everybody. And so I think we've been very deliberate, like what is our culture? What are those values? Very intentionally like reinforcing those. Like everybody's got good values on the wall, right? But who gets hired, fired, promoted, and recognized? Like that's actually what culture is. And so I think like that is generally like what is our pitch to Mesa, like why you should come here. It's like kind of those three things.
I like that. I've also heard culture is kind of the set of behaviors that you reward and you punish, right? So what are those behaviors for you guys?
Yeah, very clearly. So we don't have an acronym yet. We're working on that, but we have 6 clear values, and people first is number 1. Like it talks about, great people build great companies. If we're investing in our people, that to me is always a good bet. Obsess over the customer, like consumer business, right? Like you got to make sure you are constantly North Star is like, how do we deliver more value to the consumer? If you do that, business is going to take care of itself. Go big or go home. Again, to your point, time's limited. Like we're all only going to work at so many startups. Like life's too short to do anything other than something really meaningful and great work. Ownership mentality at early stage startup, like you got to act like an owner. Everybody here is an owner. We all act like that. Like we all recruit. We all are owners. Like we all like fill the gaps, right? There's just never enough people. And then I think the last one is just speed is a superpower, which is a cliche, but it's so true. Like we've made more progress in a year than most companies will make in 5. And that's just because like, can I do this today versus Monday? Can we move fast? How quickly can I learn, right? And so those are our 6 values. And we're very intentional on like, those are what we hire, fire, promote, and recognize around. Like there's other values that are great for other companies, but those are the ones that we think are going to help us achieve our mission.
Can you tell me where I'd love to understand some examples around these? Because I think values are great, but they get tested all the time. So do you have some ideas or do you have some stories about how your values were put into practice?
Yeah, for sure. I think like one, like we just talked about today in our team call, like think like an owner. Like we have hiring goals we got to hit, and everybody in the company has a LinkedIn sales navigator that they're using to recruit people for the roles we have open. And so that's not just like, hey, we say that, like everybody recruits, owners recruit. That's one example. I think obsess over the customer is a perfect one. Like for us, like there's a million, questions we have around like, or decisions we have to make when you think about a value prop for rewards in a card. And like, there's a lot of trade-offs for those of like, okay, well, we could give no value back to the consumer. That's the most profitable model, right? But for us, it's always like, how do we give the most value back to the consumer? Like that's our North Star. So that helps us answer a lot of those questions that like literally impacts strategy on a very tactical level of how do we think about building our products and business is like tied to our culture.
What about when some of these values come against each other? I can imagine, for example, like speed as a superpower could come against like customer obsession, where you want to ship something really, really quickly, but that might break something. And so how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that's where you kind of get into the interesting sort of like fierce intellectual debate internally, right? And like I think everybody has different elements of our cultures in stronger ways. Like for me, like I'm the ultimate like go big or go home and speed, right? And so I think that's an example like where you'd articulate it there, where I actually think the faster we move that we can get in front of that customer and the more we can learn, that's going to be better for that customer in the long term, right? Versus, hey, we think it's better to wait. Like it's never better to wait. Like the right time is almost certainly right now.
Can you tell me one of the secrets about starting companies? You've started a few now, right? You've done this a few times. What are some of the things that no one really talks about building companies or working at early stage companies?
I think a couple things. One, most people suck at interviewing. I think everybody sucks at interviewing. It's like driving. Everybody
Yeah.
thinks they're good at it, and everybody's like not very good. And so I think like when we think about hiring, like we actually try to remove interviewing as much as possible in the traditional sense of like, hey, let's have a 30-minute conversation. Let me ask you the same 5 questions as the other
Mhm.
five people you meet. Like,
Yeah.
hey, are you good at finance? Yeah, great, right? Like that's not like we try to make it, for example, one of the things we brought from Uber is like everybody, no matter how senior, goes through some sort of take-home exercise that simulates the work environment, right? Removes all the objective, but like all the subjective bias, like gives you a way to simulate the work. It's really helpful for candidates too, which is like, oh, do I actually want this job? So that's like one. I think another one is like, I actually don't think most people want to work at a startup, as I would define it. I think people want to work at like a venture-backed company, not an actual startup, right? Like kind of is like, hey, if you're looking for work-life balance, this is probably not the place for you. But if you're looking for the most demanding, most fulfilling thing you'll ever do in your life, that we can offer. And so actually like, when you talk about selling candidates, I try to actually unsell people as the last interview, where basically like get to the, are you sure you want to work at a startup? Because, I think a place like this sells itself. Ultimately, it's like, do you really want to work here? Like, how badly do you want it? What are you willing to suffer for? Right. And so I think that's just like for early stage startup, like it's extremely hard. It just is. Right. And it takes a lot of brute force effort and there's trade offs. And so I think as long as you're very transparent with folks, there's obviously a ton of good on the other side of that. But it's just something that I don't think everybody, when they say, oh, a startup sounds cool, it's like, yeah, maybe, Google sounds cool, but that's not really what I would call a startup.
So what is the anti-pitch? Like the short one. Can you give it to me?
Yeah, pretty much. It's like, hey, like if you're looking for work-life balance, this is not the place for you. And then just very bluntly, just like, hey, I think there's a ton of great things about startups. It's what I've dedicated my life to, but there's a lot of trade-offs, like there's fewer resources, there's more work to do. Like, is that something you actually want? Right. And just put it to people in that very clear sense. And like people are adults and most people will say, yeah, totally. Like I'm game for that and we're great. Or some people may say, hey, you know what? You're right. Like that's not what I'm looking for. Like, great.
Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the big challenges or projects you guys are working on right now?
Yeah. I mean, the big focus for us is the card. And so cards are really hard. And so, you have all the problems of normal software consumer businesses plus, cards have a million partners involved and they're heavily regulated. So it just takes a lot of people, like this is why probably could not have done this as my first company. You needed a track record in order, like it just takes way more people and money up front. And so I think that's just something cards are complicated versus something very simple like consumer social. And so ultimately, that's how you get your arms around a $6 trillion market is you need distribution, you need rewards partners, you need all the infrastructure partners, you need to build the thing. That just takes a lot more than, hey, let's just go build our website and get it in front of some consumers.
Is there something that's changed in the market or technology that enables the business you guys have right now? Or is it just you've come to the point where you can build this business now?
No, I think certainly, the last few years, like the call it banking as a service, credit card as a service world has allowed for companies like us and others to build new financial products, right? Historically, there were kind of five big banks that could build credit cards or debit or all the other kind of interesting products you're seeing out there. So it's allowed for it's still expensive and it's still hard, but it's now doable in a way that 5 years ago you would just have to be at a Chase or American Express, in which case it would take you 10 years to do this.
Since you guys are building stuff that is, important like money, are there ways that you have to architect your company differently than you would if you were just building a consumer app or something?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, we have two compliance people, for example, which you don't have in consumer social or anything that's non-financial services. So certainly, like there's a lot more, there's a much higher bar for, hey, like, how can we move fast? How can we get this in front of a customer, right? Like you can't just turn on a credit card and see what happens, right? And so I think that's, one of the things that we have to balance in our culture of like, we want to obsess over the customer, their data, their privacy, their security, but also we want to move fast things and learn from them to continually give them more value. So yeah, certainly it's just a much higher bar when you deal with anything that's consumer financial services related.
When you talked about hiring, I think one of the things that you talked about was just putting the effort in. Is that kind of your secret to hiring? Just put the effort in and go for it? Or do you have other things that you do to help you win talent?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, we think about it like just any customer journey, like there's, from the very first touch they hear about us to their first 30 days, like there's a very detailed process within each of those, not just like, how do we find these people? Like referrals are the best hires you'll ever get because they're very de-risked and they come from a known source. Direct outreach is number two because like those are you can be very specific. But then like how do you actually interview those people so that you and I, if we're interviewing a new team member, you and I don't ask the same three questions when we both have time with that person, for example. Then, okay, how do you put together an offer that's compelling? Like, what's the data set you want to use for that? How do you close, right? Like, that's particularly hard. And so, no, I think about it as like there's steps within each of those. We have a very deliberate strategy, both from outreach to interviewing to closing to, onboarding. And so it is the common thread of that is it's a lot of work. But certainly like there is an element of it, which is like, you're going to have to go reach out to 100 people to get one of them that's the right fit for that particular role you want, just because there's so much of it that's out of your control. So yeah, brute force is a big chunk of it.
Talk to me a little bit about selecting talent. So what are the qualities you look for, or maybe the top quality that you look for candidates that join your company?
Yeah, certainly I think there's like a scorecard and a framework we have for every role of like culture fit, functional skills, entrepreneurial ability, emotional intelligence. But I think like the one thing, if I had to boil it down to like all else equal, right? Like what's that thing that's going to make somebody a killer here? It's like there's just a hunger in those people, right? They want to work at a company of this stage. They've kind of got something to prove. And it may be for a million different reasons, but there's always that like that hungry dog in them, like a hungry dog runs faster, right? And so I think that's the thing that makes people thrive in an early stage company like this is like, for whatever reason, we're all motivated in our own ways, like highly intrinsically motivated. And they've just got this like hunger deep inside them. And like, I know I've got it, but like the people we bring in here, they all have their own reason why they're just here to do something really important.
How do you figure that out? I don't know if you can see that on a resume. What do you do to understand if they have that hunger?
Yeah, I mean, and that's where I think it comes down to like how you sell talents. Like you got to figure out what they want, right? Before you can sell anything. And so you got to tease that out from folks. Everybody's motivated in different ways. It could be, I was a former fat little kid and that like produced whatever inadequacies that I had to compensate for, right? Or, hey, maybe somebody got passed up at some point in their career or, whatever, right? Like they had some reason and like you can get to somebody's why eventually. They've all typically got that thing that they really want. Maybe they want to start their own thing to prove something, right? How do we help them? This tour of duty, we are the stepping stone for that. Or, hey, they want to drive a really big financial outcome for their family. How do we pitch that, right? Those are two different things to sell. So it's kind of like all sales. You got to kind of figure out what motivates that person. Where do they want to get? What's the outcome they're trying to drive? And then how do you tell them that, hey, what we're offering helps you take that next step there?
How do you get that? Like, do you ask directly or do you have other strategies to get that why out of them?
Yeah, I think, you can ask, hearing people tell their story can sometimes be really helpful, right? And then you're always trying to get to that why behind it, right? Hey, that was an interesting choice in your life. Like, why'd you take that job? Why'd you get into this? Why are you working in startups, right? Always a good question for people. Like, everybody, again, is like, you just typically ask why enough times, and people honestly may not know it themselves. Like it,
Mm.
takes a while for you to have that own self awareness, and so I think you can uncover people's like real motivations behind things if you just ask good questions and listen.
What's a way that candidates can stand out to you that they might not be doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, like my dad would always say, like 90% of life is just showing up. So like following up, like that's something like I'm super militant about. Like I always follow up, whether it's a partner or candidate. Like most people don't do that, right? And it's a simple thing of just like, hey, thanks for taking the time. Great to meet you, right? Like those people really stand out because it shows something very thoughtful, right? It's just like, hey, you valued that person's time. Like that's great, and that's why like we have a cultural value internally. Like we're always on time. That's another thing, right? Being on time, one, helps you move faster because you don't waste time. But more importantly, it's a sign of respect. Like I will always be on time because I value your time as much as my own. So something as simple as just like following up is a good way to stand out.
So AI has changed the way a lot of people work now. I think as big as like Google coming out, many, many years ago. How has it changed the way you guys operate?
Um, I think there's certain like tools we use that do make us much more productive. Like Reclaim is a really cool AI calendar app. Like that's really helpful for me, right? It like that's just like very useful, right? Or Granola is an awesome note-taking app that does that. So to be honest, I think it's kind of been at the edges of like some productivity stuff that we use. I don't think it's changed kind of the core of like humans and like two people in a room together with a whiteboard.
Yeah.
Typically still is the best technology we have. I'm sure those things will continue to get better and better, but I think for the most part, like who knows what the future looks like? But I do know there are a few things for certain. Like customers are always going to want more value. They're always going to want more convenience and better service, right? And so, like, if you know those things, it's kind of easy where you go to. And some of these tools can help you get there faster.
Are you guys a remote company or in person?
A little bit of both. So we've
Okay.
got people kind of all over, but we've got an office in New York and in Austin. And then I travel a lot and we try to get together face to face as much as possible.
So how do you do that? You mentioned, the whiteboarding is kind of the best thing you can do. How do you balance that with being able to find talent everywhere and being a
Yeah.
hybrid remote?
Yeah, I mean, I think we made that conscious choice. Like, look, like we know the most important thing is to get the very best people, and so that's why we want to hire people anywhere. And then let's figure out how we make sure for the things that are really valuable for us to be together for, we are. Whether it's planning for quarterly objectives or more creative exercises, like, hey, what are the big cool stunts we want to do this year? But certain things don't need that, right? Which is like if you're doing deep IC work, like you probably shouldn't go into an office to then be on your computer by yourself. So I think it's like, working together and learning. Like you're kind of in that early stage of a company, you figure out everybody's got their own style. We got to work through this stuff. So it's a lot of trial and error. And I think like there's, what I've learned, like there's no good system. Like every system has trade-offs, whether it's 5 days in office or fully remote. And so you just got to be okay with whatever trade-offs are most acceptable to you. And that, I think when you frame it that way, you're like, okay, this is pretty good versus like, hey, this isn't perfect. I don't think there's a perfect system.
That makes sense. So for you, what are your biggest challenges facing you as a founder right now?
Yeah, I think a couple things. Like one is just continuing to get really great talent. Like I think like, we have amazing people. We want to get even better people and we're gonna need to get a lot more of them over the next year, right? And so how do we make sure we get in front of those awesome candidates that are not actively looking is always one. And then two, I think it's just like, how do we say no to stuff? For us, like there's so many cool things we could be doing. And that's where like, prioritization is really hard, right? Like we cannot do all of these things, certainly not at once. And so what are you going to say no to? That's actually the really hard thing for a business like ours. Like it could go in so many cool directions. So how do we say no to do a few things really well, knowing that there's awesome things we're intentionally saying no to? So just that like constant prioritization of like, I want to do everything. I want all of it, but we can only do so much in order to do a few things well.
Do you have any heuristics that you use to help you prioritize these things?
Yeah, I think it's, kind of like there's a bunch of different frameworks for that stuff of like, hey, what's the expected lift and then the output. I think generally like we kind of always start with our mission. Like, what's our mission? Make homeownership more affordable and rewarding. When we look at these different things, like which one of these is going to help us do that more? And so a great example is like, hey, we may not launch a new product as early as we want to because we want to focus on the card because we know the card's going to have the biggest impact for that. And so like that's just like one example of like, actually living up to your mission, it's a really good North Star. It's not just like a nice thing you say to people. It should help you run your business because from your mission to your values to then your actual strategy and quarterly objectives, like it should all kind of flow naturally. If it feels disjointed, then one of those things is not right.
That makes sense. So as we enter 2025, what's next for you guys?
Yeah, pretty simple for us. It's just continue to scale the business. And so scaling the card, because that allows us to scale other products and then all the things that are needed for that, people, money, tools, all that stuff. So really, for me, the next year, it's continue to bring in great partners, continue to bring in great talent, and continue to deliver more value to our consumers so that we can grow our business.
Well, thanks so much, Sean. This has been awesome to hear about your company. Where should people go to hear more about Mesa?
Yeah, please check out our website, mesamember.com. We're actively hiring for a number of great roles, so would love to chat with anybody who's passionate about our mission. So appreciate you having me on as well. This is great. Thank you again.
Thanks, Kelley.